The wind moved strangely that morning, low, looping, and too gentle for how bitter the cold had become. A crow sat hunched on a wire strung between two leaning poles, feathers puffed but eyes alert, watching the tree line below. Something was moving along the gully. At first, it might have passed for a fox, too far to see color, but the way it paused, turned back, then pressed forward with a limping resolve, it didn't move like anything wild. A dog, perhaps, thin, its gait uneven. As it neared the edge of the woods, the outline grew clearer. The fur along its spine bristled with ice. One ear hung low, torn or frozen stiff. There was blood around the shoulder, dried to a deep black crust, but it was the look in its eyes, steady, heavy, that marked it different. Not lost, not panicked. Focused. Eileen's cabin sat half buried in snow at the bend where the road used to be. Before they stopped plowing it past the ranger station, she hadn't expected visitors since September at 72. She liked the silence. She liked her stove, her books, the blue mug with the chip in the lip. She'd seen dogs wander through before, after storms or from logging camps. They'd never stayed. But this one didn't wander. It approached directly, straight down the slope. No barking, no hesitation. She watched from behind the pane, her fingers curled around a tin of tobacco she hadn't touched in years. When the dog finally reached the porch, it didn't look up, just turned sideways and stood, letting its flank press against the wooden step. And behind it, barely visible in the white-on-white of snowfall, something else moved. A shape, lower to the ground. Slower. A child. Small, not bundled for the weather. No coat, only a dark sweater pulled over another. Jeans soaked to the knees. He stumbled as he neared the last drift, but didn't fall, and he leaned against the dog's side, eyes wide and glassy, blinking slow as if even that used too much energy. He didn't speak. Neither did the dog. Eileen opened the door, not quite remembering how she got there. The warmth inside gusted outward, curling around the boy's ankles, catching the dog's fur. They stood still a moment longer, as if waiting for something to be said. Then the boy stepped in. The dog didn't follow. Eileen knelt beside him, hand gently brushing his wrist to check the pulse. It fluttered beneath his skin, weak but there. His lips were cracked, nails dark, no gloves, no hat. She reached for the radio, already calculating the distance to the nearest medic post, when she realized the boy's other hand was curled into a fist, tight, clenched so hard the knuckles were bone white. She pried gently. Inside his hand was a ribbon, not a child's thing. It was old, faded tartan pattern, like the kind worn in school uniforms long out of fashion. Threadbare. He didn't look at her, just stared at the door. She turned back toward it. The dog was gone. Not far, though. She spotted it moments later near the edge of the woods again, head down, paws breaking fresh trail in the untouched snow. It didn't look back. Later, after the boy was warmed and swaddled in thick blankets, Eileen pressed him with quiet questions, name, where he'd come from. But the child spoke only once. She found me. Who, Eileen had asked, but the boy just shook his head and closed. His eyes, not in fear, not even tiredness, something else, as if he didn't quite want to explain, or couldn't. And then, hours later, when the sun had dipped behind the slope and long shadows settled over the tree line, Eileen spotted movement again, a different direction this time, near the place where the creek used to flow before it. Froze, just a flicker, enough for the crow to lift from its perch and wheel once in the air. But Eileen had seen it too. There in the snow were tracks, not just paw prints, something broader. A second set, parallel, deeper. As though the dog hadn't come alone. The dog returned, just before dawn. Eileen hadn't slept. The child stirred now and then in the rocker beside the stove, one arm still bandaged, the other clinging to the ribbon like it anchored him to this world. Outside, the frost was thick on the windows. The oil lamp had long guttered out, but she hadn't relit it. Just watched the darkness shift as snow turned the forest pale again. At first she imagined it's a soft tap of paw on wood. Then again, a rhythm too deliberate for the wind. She unlatched the door. The dog was standing on the porch, breath misting through the air. But this time, something was different. It wasn't alone. Behind it, near the base of the twisted spruce, something crouched. Eileen stepped out, boots crunching over snowpack. The shape moved, slow and labored. Another dog, smaller, younger, its side heaving with each breath. It didn't lift its head fully, only glanced up once before laying it down again. There was a gash across its back leg, jagged, fresh. The older dog turned and walked a few paces, then paused, looking back not at her but at the injured one, then again to her. It didn't need to speak. The gesture was enough. She moved quickly, fetching a blanket and the old wooden sled from behind the cabin. It hadn't been used in years, not since she stopped hauling firewood herself, but the runners still held. She patted the bottom with straw from the storage shed and, with effort, lifted the wounded animal onto it. The dog didn't resist, only winced slightly when her hand brushed the leg. As she dragged the sled inside, she felt the older dog's eyes on her. It didn't follow. It remained at the porch's edge, tail lowered, shoulders stiff, as if unsure. It belonged in this act of rescue. Inside, the child opened his eyes as the door clicked shut. He looked at the new dog without surprise. His fingers tightened around the ribbon, and for the first time, his voice cracked the silence. "She tried to find me," he whispered, but she was too slow. He didn't say who, but Eileen didn't need names. The new dog whimpered softly as she examined the wound. It looked like it had come from barbed wire to clean to be a bite. Somewhere out there, they'd crossed something sharp. The child had made it through. This one hadn't. By afternoon, clouds gathered low, thick and heavy. Snow softened to sleet. It tapped against the metal roof like an uncertain drumbeat. Eileen brewed broth, thin and warm, and let the scent carry. The child took it, trembling hands wrapped around the cup. He still hadn't said much, but his eyes followed her more now. He flinched less. The older dog finally entered as the light began to fade. It did so quietly, almost unwillingly, padding to the edge of the room and settling near the door, watching, waiting. Eileen noticed something then. A tag half buried under the dog's thick neck fur. She hadn't seen it before, maybe missed it in the frost. She reached for it slowly, palm open, not to spook it. The dog stiffened but didn't growl. Her fingers brushed metal. The tag had no name, only a number stamped crooked, as if done by hand, and an old logo she didn't recognize. Not a city registry, not local. She traced it once with her thumb, then let go. Something about it didn't sit right. That night, the child slept deeper, the ribbon now tucked beneath his pillow. The injured dog dozed beside the stove, its breathing steadier, but the older one didn't rest. It stood by the window unmoving, staring out into the woods. Eileen couldn't tell if it was guarding or watching for something to return. We stepped out once more before turning in. The storm had passed, the snow was crisp again, and the wind quieted to a hush, but she noticed something strange along the trail the dog had taken earlier. 2 sets of prints, yes, but a third, barely visible, spaced oddly, like boots. Heavy ones, old, not hers. They came up halfway from the east edge of the forest, then stopped. No prints going back. Just a place where the snow had been scuffed as though someone had stood there for a long time. Watching. Eileen lit the stove again just after dusk. Not because it was cold, though the air inside had begun to feel heavy, but because the silence had deepened too much. The kind of quiet that pressed into the corners of a room and made her bones ache with memory. The boy hadn't spoken since that first sentence. He hadn't cried either. He simply watched the doorway, his shoulders hunched slightly under the wool blanket, the ribbon still clutched in his palm. He hadn't let it go. Outside, the snow had begun to shift in texture. No longer the light dust of morning, but the brittle, sticky sort that clumped under boots and clung to tree bark. A subtle change, but it made the forest sound different. The wind moved slower. Branches bent lower. It was the hour when wild things usually stilled before true night. But Eileen felt eyes not malevolent, not even curious, just waiting. She stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, and scanned the tree line. The gully was dark now, but her eyes caught something glinting near the base of the ridge. She walked slowly down the path, boots crunching in rhythm, and there, half buried near the shrubs, was a small tin tag, dull with time. It had been rubbed clean on one side, as if by constant touch, just 3 letters etched roughly into it. EMI. She turned it over. No address, no collar. A sharp crack echoed behind her, a branch snapping, clean and sudden. She pivoted instinctively, but there was no movement. Just the still silhouettes of trees and an edge of wind that felt off too warm, as if from something breathing. Back inside, the boy had moved. He stood now near the edge of the rug, staring at the ash bucket beside the fire. His brow furrowed, like he was remembering a rule he couldn't quite recall. Then he reached for the poker, and without glancing at Eileen, gently nudged a burning log back into place. The gesture was practiced, not something a child his age would know. Eileen opened her mouth to speak but stopped. That night she slept only briefly, waking often to the shifting creaks of the cabin. Once she thought she heard the low huff of an animal outside the wall, not a growl. A breath heavy, resigned. On the morning, she found fresh tracks again. Dog tracks, but alongside them, another trail, not bear, not wolf, something wider in stride, almost careful, like it was circling, not stalking. Later that day, when the ranger finally reached the cabin on snowmobile, low and cautious with the new snowfall, he examined the boy with clinical calm, pulse still slow, slight dehydration, no frostbite, but no missing child reports matched his description, and no dogs registered to the name EMI. Eileen told him about the dog, the tag, the silence. The ranger listened, nodded, but she could see it in his face, the doubt. He asked gently if she might have misremembered. Old tag feral strays sometimes picked up junk. The woods played tricks. Long winters did strange things, but she insisted. The dog was with him, protective, alert, and gone again before she could stop it. The ranger took a look around the property, followed the footprints, then paused at the edge of the tree line. He crouched. There was a dead rabbit half buried in the snow. Not scavenged, not shredded, lay. Its fur was intact. No signs of struggle, its eyes open. A clean wound just below the ribs, placed like an offering. By afternoon, the boy had begun to speak in fragmented phrases, quiet, halting, but one line stopped Eileen in her tracks. "She waits," he said, barely a whisper. "She doesn't want to come in." "Why?" she asked softly, but the boy only stared at the fire again. Later, Eileen walked the edge of the gully once more, past the rabbit, past the tracks, and there, wedged in the base of a crooked pine, was a remnant of blue cloth, weathered, torn, part of a child's coat. The fabric was stiff with age, edges frayed by time. She brushed snow from it and stared. The stitching didn't look recent. The weave was wrong, thick, almost coarse. Back at the cabin, she opened her old box of photographs. Ranger programs, firewatch seasons, local school volunteers, and their Behind a yellowed safety flyer was a black and white snapshot from a winter decades ago. Group of children, snow piled high behind them. A dog sitting proudly at the front, one ear low. The tag on its collar caught the light. She looked closer, and there in the middle of the row a boy, maybe 8, maybe 9, stood with his hand resting on the dog's back, wearing a coat made of that same blue cloth, but it wasn't the same boy. Sleeping by a fire. He was older than the child in her cabin now. The child had fallen asleep with the ribbon still clenched between his fingers, his breath shallow but steady now. Eileen sat nearby, one boot unlaced, coat draped across her lap, staring out the window toward the tree line. The dog's tracks had already softened under a new dusting of snow, but that second trail, the one that ran alongside the paw prints, had not melted into the same blur. It was heavier, wider, and it led deeper into the forest, not out. The stove hissed gently. The lantern's flame leaned once in a draft, then righted itself. Outside, dusk turned the landscape into blue and silver. She hadn't radioed yet. Something stopped her. Not fear exactly, but a resistance in her chest that she couldn't explain. A feeling that calling others too soon would break something delicate. Whatever had brought the boy here. It wasn't done. Near midnight, the dog returned, not to the door but to the edge of the clearing, half-shadowed, partially hidden behind a fallen spruce. It didn't approach. It stood motionless, barely visible but watching. This time, Eileen stepped out. She didn't put on her boots. She didn't call to it. Just stood at the edge of the porch, letting her breath fog the air between them. The snow whispered softly under her socks. Cold bit her toes. Then she saw it farther behind the dog, up the slope where the old ranger path had been buried by years of undergrowth and forgotten storms. Something shifted, tall, still, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong to trees. A figure, maybe, or a shape leaning unnaturally forward, just long enough for Eileen to notice. And then it was gone. She didn't sleep, not fully. She dozed, with one ear tuned to the boy's breath and the other tuned to the forest. No more movement, no howls, not even wind. In the morning the boy was awake. He sat up slowly, blinking at the unfamiliar wood beams overhead. The ribbon had fallen beside him during the night. Eileen crouched nearby, offering tea in a chipped enamel mug. He took it, no words. Then, as if pulled by memory, he touched the scar just beneath his jaw, a shallow mark, faint but old. And Eileen finally saw something shift in his eyes. Not panic, not recognition, but wait. A child carrying something that didn't belong to him. "I followed the bell," he said, barely audible. Eileen's fingers froze around the mug. "What bell?" He looked out the window. She had one. On her collar. He didn't answer. Outside, the snow had stopped. A single crow circled low above the clearing, then drifted sideways and vanished behind the slope. When Eileen stepped outside, she found new prints, fresh, distinct. The dog had returned again, closer this time, but this time, another set ran alongside. Not human, not canine. Wider paws, longer stride, slight drag on the right. She followed the tracks for 100 yards. Then 200. Her breath grew faster, but not from the cold. Trees grew denser here, their trunks bending like listeners, toward something unseen. The trail ended at the old ranger station, just bones of a building now, half a roof. A broken door swinging on chain hinges. And there, resting just inside the collapsed wall, was a collar frayed, bell still attached. It made no sound when she lifted it, but her fingers tingled. There were bite marks on the leather, not fresh, but not old either. She walked back slower than she came. The boy was waiting by the porch, not inside. No coat, but not shivering. He didn't ask what she'd found. Instead, he simply asked, "Will she leave now?" Eileen didn't answer. That night, the wind came from the east, colder, more brittle, the kind that breaks branches instead of bending them. The lantern flickered again, and somewhere, deep in the woods, something let out a low, hoarse sound. Not a growl, not a bark, but a kind of calling. This time, it wasn't the dog. The sound from the forest never came again by morning. The snow had stilled to a fine, glinting crust. No new prints, no returning shadows. The boy rose before dawn, and stood quietly at the edge of the porch, the old ribbon still tucked in his pocket. Eileen didn't stop him. She watched from the window, letting the kettle hum low behind her. He wasn't going far, just to the place where the prince had vanished the day before. He stood there a long while, hands at his sides, head slightly bowed, not in prayer or fear, but something quieter. A knowing. She joined him a few minutes later, her boots crunching the frost in soft protest. He didn't look up, just nodded once, as if the silence had finally explained something he hadn't been able to. They stood like that for a while too, still figures in a world waking slow, before he turned back toward the cabin that afternoon. The ranger arrived by snowmobile, a young man from the station down. Eileen told him enough. Not everything. She left out the collar, the second trail. She only said the boy had come with a dog, and the dog had led him out. The boy didn't add anything. When asked his name, he gave it. When asked where he lived, he simply pointed north and said, "We walked a long time." Later, Eileen would learn the boy had been missing for 3 nights. Search parties had scoured the wrong area entirely. The dog, a female shepherd mix, once belonging to the boy's aunt, had vanished 2 winters ago during a snowstorm. Her name had been Belle. No one ever found her body. No one ever found her tracks either. Not beyond Eileen's ridge. The boy was taken in by distant relatives, somewhere closer to town. Eileen received a note weeks later, written carefully in the child's hand. He thanked her for the tea and said he still had the ribbon. No one else had ever asked about it. She kept the collar, hung it near the door, behind a rusted horseshoe and a faded ranger map no longer accurate. It made no sound when the wind passed through, but she swore the leather softened a little as spring came. In early April, when the last of the snow broke into slush along the tree roots, Eileen walked the old path behind the station one last time. The prints were long gone, but she followed the slope where she remembered them falling in pairs. Dog and whatever had walked beside her. She paused at the stump near the edge of the ridge and watched the treetops shift in the distance. No sound, no shape, just a faint warm breeze, tugging gently through the dead grasses, lifting the finest seeds into the air. They spiraled once, then disappeared downhill, their movement so subtle it almost looked like breath.